His lawyer leaned in and whispered 5 words that turned his face white. He had been smiling the whole morning, the kind of grin people wear when they think they've outsmarted the world. Sunlight caught on his watch and fractured into little arrogant flashes as he shifted in the witness chair. I remember the sound of his shoes on the courtroom tile, the faint creak of the bench as he adjusted himself, that ridiculous self-assurance that comes from believing a story loud enough times. The whisper was small. It shouldn't have mattered. It wasn't dramatic. But when someone tells you, in the middle of a legal form, that by signing you accept all liabilities associated with transferred assets, those words are paper. Paper carries weight. Paper carries bankruptcy notices, mortgage riders, overdue invoices. Paper carries the sound of your life being measured and tallied. Vincent read those words, and for the first time he saw the arithmetic he had wanted to ignore. My mouth looks calmer than my heart feels. That, more than anything, is how I survived those years, acting like the world could not see the churning underneath. But this story isn't about a triumphant scream in a courtroom. It's about why I built a quiet, legal lock for my son, and why, when Vincent said he wanted everything, I let him have it. On paper. My name is Alexis Dunst. 3 years before that courtroom whisper, I had been quietly tracing wires from midnight bank statements, following a trail that smelled faintly of adrenaline and desperation. Mortgages taken out twice, lines of credit maxed in the same month, gambling withdrawals that glowed red on my screen like bad weather. I worked in law for years, not because it made me arrogant, but because it gave me a vocabulary for danger. When you can name a thing, you can protect against it. He met me when we were young. Vincent had the kind of charm that looked effortless, a smile that suggested he'd been handpicked by sunlight. I was the earnest kind of young professional who believed in hard work. We married because we had the same hunger, him for building something big, me for being the person who could keep its edges neat. I left a promising path at a law firm to partner with him when the real estate project started scaling. I did it because I believed in the life we were building together, and because motherhood felt like something I wanted to do on our terms. You learn to measure sacrifice differently when you have a child. Tyler arrived, and for a long time, his needs replaced every ambition that wasn't directly about keeping him safe and fed and loved. I became, without drama, the scheduler of everything: contractors, orthodontists, piano lessons, volunteer shifts. I read spreadsheets at 2 a.m. While he slept in the next room, scribbled appointment times on the recipe cards from my grandmother, and folded her napkin-stiffened wisdom into the new life we were trying to tidy into a home. My grandmother's recipe box sat on a high shelf in our kitchen for years. It made the kitchen smell like cardstock and citrus. It taught me that sometimes the most precious things are tiny and greasy and stacked. There was a card in her box that read, in her looping handwriting, something like, "Not everything that looks like bread will feed you." She wrote that during the war. It stayed with me. Appearances are not guarantees. So I baked the bread. I polished invoices until they shone. I answered emails at odd hours. I did the slow labor that nobody applauded, balancing vendor relationships, nurturing the business's public face, calming clients when Vincent went ghost for a week and then returned with a plan he hadn't bothered to explain. I counted my labor as love for a long time, and I counted badly. Because things that look prosperous from the road sometimes have foundations of paper and hope. For 3 years I found inconsistencies that I could not explain away, payments to companies that had no local address, recent withdrawals for investment opportunities whose only proof was a login that never let me in, and a pattern of mortgages being taken on properties that, to my knowledge, were already pledged. Those numbers don't make for a good scene in a romantic comedy. They make for a growing knot in your chest. At first I thought confrontation would fix it. "We can figure this out," I told him in the dark of our kitchen, whispering like a conspirator so our son wouldn't hear me pace. "Just let me help." He smiled and promised patience. Later he smiled and promised returns. Promises are a currency that loses value when measured against dollars and contract terms. There are two ways to respond to the discovery of betrayal. One is furious theater. Expose, shout, litigate at the drop of a hat. The other is patient architecture. Build a wall around what you can save. I have never been the impulsive type. My grandmother's recipes taught patience the way they taught yields, leave the dough to rest. So I chose architecture. 3 years before the hearing, which felt, at the time, like a lifetime but in retrospect was the only useful span, I began moving things. Not in dramatic, cinematic boxes of evidence I could finally slam down on a table. No. I started quietly, in the everyday ways someone who wants to protect a child must. An IRA transfer, a conversation with my uncle, a legal consultation that was, for weeks, merely a clarifying conversation. My uncle is retired now, an accountant who smells perpetually faintly of pocket lint and tea. He has the kind of mind that keeps numbers honest and feels insulted by sloppy ledgers. He taught me to think about ownership in ways that don't require loud proclamations. I put Grandma's small inheritance, $340,000, money she had tucked away in a safety deposit box and meant for the boy always to have, into an irrevocable trust for Tyler. I did it with paper that couldn't be touched, with clauses so plain even a judge would nod. An irrevocable trust is not dramatic. It doesn't make for social media sound bites. But it's a wall that requires a battering ram. It felt like arthritis strength material, slow, solid, lawful. I placed my IRA in a protective shell too. These moves weren't meant to punish. They were meant to prevent. I set everything up so that Tyler's share could never be unilaterally seized if his father tried to take the house and the business. I copied bank statements and hid them in places that weren't obvious. I printed invoices and receipts and left electronic copies behind encrypted passwords only my uncle and an attorney could access. I made sure there were dates on the documents. You'd be surprised how much power a timestamp holds in a court of law. And then I waited. Patience, as it turned out, was the hardest part. You spend years cooking a strategy that depends on someone else moving. You have to watch them make themselves vulnerable to their own choices. Vincent didn't betray us overnight. He moved in increments so small they mattered only in the aggregate. He became more absent, not just physically, but in ways that left me responsible for more and more. He took on projects that promised rapid returns, then took them off the books when they went sour. He told people we were expanding. He told family we were investing. Lorraine, his mother, believed him. Lorraine is a woman who measures worth in visible things: golf clubs, holiday spreads, the shape of a dining room table. She was never subtle about whom she favored. Her loyalty to Vincent was as inherited as her china. When he announced his intention to separate, Lorraine stood at her kitchen sink and watched me stacking dirty plates and said, in a tone that was designed to hurt more than inform, "He always did the building. You were the tending." There were friends who chose sides, too. Diane had been in our social circle for a decade, a steady presence at our dinners, a person who knew the names of Tyler's teachers and the way I took my coffee. She pivoted in a way that felt like a physical shove. She became Vincent's informal confessor. The small betrayals lodged like splinters, a text message forwarded, a detail omitted, a birthday invitation that arrived for everyone but me. Diane claimed later that she was trying to keep the peace. What she was keeping was siding with the loudest story. She visited our house for coffee and left with access she shouldn't have had. The humiliation that followed his initial demand for divorce was sharp and social. He brought a lawyer who could find the right cadence of empathy and steel, a voice that suggested inevitability. He paraded someone new through our rooms, Brittany. She was younger, of the sort of glossy, effortless type who wore confidence like a new coat and could smile through a kitchen she had not earned. She would stand in the doorway, drag a heel on the threshold, and look at the things we had collected as if they were props in a show she had a right to critique. When he announced he wanted everything, the statement was casually cruel. "I want the house, The cars, the business, he told me one afternoon from the doorway of our home office. He said it like he was listing groceries. You can keep whatever you want, Alexis. He said it as if I was being unreasonable to want to keep more than a single suitcase and a meager bank account. It sounded at first like anger without calculation, but there was calculation. There always was. Vincent had decided that what looked like wealth should be his to wield. He didn't understand just then that taking something is not the same as being able to sustain it. That would soon be the delicate hinge of the whole story. He would take everything, and the gravity of those things would be his alone. Before the estate lawyers filed papers, he paraded his victory like sport, sending photographs and posts that showed what he was about to claim. Lorraine posted something about new beginnings that read like a congratulations to suspiciously empty promises. Friends responded with either the predictable platitudes or the quiet curiosity that hates to be caught on the wrong side of gossip. Tyler watched it all with a teenager's attention to which parent had the cooler voice on video and which parent smiled in the right way. Teenagers have a talent for interpreting pain through the lens of appearances. For a while, Tyler sided with the visible story. His father appeared to be winning. I did not tell Tyler everything. I couldn't. Children are anchors that need more than truth, stability. I told him enough to protect him, that some things were being arranged for him, that he would be safe, but I didn't tell him how. He knew I was angry. He heard the edge in my voice. He felt the absence of sleep in the way my hands trembled when I made pancakes for him on a school day. He asked once quietly, "Are we going to lose everything?" I held his gaze across the cereal bowl and said, "We're going to keep what matters." I worked with Nina Castellano in those months, a woman with eyes that can look at a ledger and not blink. Nina is the sort of lawyer whose presence rearranges the energy of a room. She doesn't do miracles, but she knows the architecture of law as if it were a landscape map. She heard the numbers I had found, and she heard the story of the boxes and the kitchen cards and the recipes that had been our small rituals. Instead of offering theatrical promises, she asked about documents. She asked calmly, "Do you have copies?" That question became the starting rudder of everything. We put evidence in 3 different places. One set of documents lived on the cloud, encrypted behind accounts only my uncle and I had access to. One set was paper copies in a safe deposit box under my maiden name. And one set, perhaps most importantly, was in the hands of someone who could act legally on short notice. I did not hide things out of paranoia. I hid things to be practical. The man I loved had become an unreliable steward of the household finances. I treated that as a fact, not a moral failing to be shouted from rooftops. There's a particular kind of loneliness in making these plans. Your marriage becomes a set of files. Your kitchen table might as well be an arbitration desk. Friends start to resemble case studies. I was, for a while, acting like an administrator of a household estate rather than a wife. It felt reductive in private and necessary in public. The trick was to make it appear that I would acquiesce without giving up the child that all of my careful planning was meant to protect. The plan we hatched was, in its outward form, infuriatingly simple. I would present as defeated. I would accept in mediation a sum that looked like a compromise, enough for immediate stability but not spectacular. Contractually, I would sign a release and allow Vincent to take what he wanted. People would applaud his victory. They would call him decisive. Meanwhile, the agreement would carry a liability disclosure addendum. That addendum, the hinge of the whole plan, would list every debt tied to the assets he had demanded. The debts would not be invented. They already existed. Mortgages, lines of credit, business loans, unpaid vendor bills. By signing, he would be legally assuming those liabilities. Nina phrased it without flourish. Let him have the title, make him hold the note. It was a legalism that in plain words meant, if he wants the grandeur, let him pay for the plumbing. I remember laughing the first time she said it, softly, because it felt like mild revenge penned in law, not in malice, but in consequence. Still, I wanted to be clear. This wasn't about glee. I wanted Tyler safe and myself free enough to breathe. There were nights I lay awake and ran scenarios. What if the judge rejected the addendum? What if Harold, Vincent's lawyer, managed to spin it out of being enforceable? What if Diane's betrayals escalated into something that made the plan brittle? Those nights taught me to trust design. When your plan is built of paper and signatures, what matters most is the order in which things happen. Discovery first, protection second, performance last. In the months of preparation, I learned to perform a secondary role, that of the grieving woman who wanted little. I practiced stooped shoulders. I practiced the careful, tasteful wardrobe of someone who had suffered, but with dignity. People give you a lot of space when you appear small. They also underestimate you. There were small cruelties to endure. Lorraine would bring pastries and make a show of concern in front of neighbors. She would ask, pointedly, about Tyler's schooling, as if raising him were a score to be tallied. She owned our social circle the way some people own a weekend home. She set the tone. Diane would show up at gatherings and ask casual questions, leaning in with the softness of someone who knew too much. Brittany posted images of herself on our terrace, drinking coffee in a shirt that had once belonged to me and scoring likes from people who'd never seen the long nights I had kept the business afloat. It all felt performative, because it was. Vincent wanted a clean public narrative. He had been the builder, I had been the nurturer, and now, in his framing, he would be the one to rescue the family fortune from the brink. He assumed I would resist on principle, that I would attempt to keep the house or the car or whatever decorative trophy he imagined. He did not understand the arithmetic. When the mediation date arrived, everything looked like a scene from an architectural rendering of grief. A neutrally painted conference room, tasteful water on the table, a mediator's smile that suggested helpfulness. I walked in with Nina by my side, and my heart was a compass needle trying to find true north. I wore what felt like a suitable outfit for someone who had decided to put on grief as a garment. The room smelled faintly of lemon cleaner. Vincent arrived with Harold, books under his arm, and a superficial calm that was meant to intimidate. I sat across from a man who had no idea what was written in the addendum. He had been coached to believe in outcomes built on bravado. He had been told that public victories were more valuable than private caution. He had not read the receipts because he did not want to. I let him think he was winning. It felt like the right performance. I let him smile. I let him sign the lines he was offered. I let him take the crest. What he did not see was the ledger of liabilities that would, in 2 weeks or 2 months, grow sharp teeth. This is where I will leave the story for a moment, not because the climax isn't arriving, but because the build matters. There is weight in the way quiet plans meet loud demands. I want you to understand the full cost that he did not anticipate, not just the dollar total of liabilities, not only the social collapse of a family that had been propped up by appearances, but the personal recalibration. How a son looks at a father afterwards, how a woman learns to live with herself when she chooses to be strategic rather than theatrical. I will tell you what happens in the courtroom, how a man's smile falters when the math is finally visible, and how the life he thought he was buying with his signature began to unspool. But before that, there are details that make the next moments bite harder. The boxes packed with the things I did not think to protect. The small apartment I would end up in months later, where my grandmother's recipe box fits beneath a lamp and makes the whole place smell like rosemary. The first time Tyler came to me and said, without the teenage dramatics, "I get it now." Those are the human pieces. These are the things I guarded as fiercely as any trust. If you like these kinds of true story justice narratives, hit subscribe. There are more stories about people who thought the ledger would never catch up to them. Stay with me, because the next part is where paper does what paper is meant to do. After mediation, after the actors left the stage and newspapers posted the photographs, the real theater began. Vincent left our home with keys and a smile and a certainty that is expensive when purchased without reading the fine print. He began recalibrating his life around the grandeur he had insisted on. He started signing letters with the title he'd always wanted. He went to parties and announced our amicable split, as if the word amicable could paper over unpaid invoices. He did not yet know about the $1.9 million of liabilities waiting on the other end. He did not yet know bills don't make themselves go away because you are confident enough to wear a suit. He did not understand that to be master of a property is also to be master of its unpaid work orders, and its contractor disputes, and its contested liens. I watched him from the periphery as he took his victory lap. Brittany's shoes made a rhythm that should have been a metronome for his mistakes, one step faster than the reality beneath. Diane was careful to be conciliatory in public, but I heard her voice in behind-closed-doors phone calls. Lorraine started hosting dinners that displayed a pity she thought lavish and which felt to me like a cleanup crew for her son's conscience. Meanwhile, I went back to the documents. Nina and I checked and double-checked that the trust was watertight. My uncle rerun the math until his eyes watered. It is perhaps unromantic to find release in spreadsheets, but when you're trying to protect a child from chaos, spreadsheets feel like armor. There were nights I felt like a fraud. I would make tea and sit at an old second-hand table I found for the apartment I would move into, and I would cook using my grandmother's recipes. The smell of lemon and cardamom pulled me into a different kind of memory, a life built of person-to-person care rather than ledgers. I would feel grief for the house, for the noises of the old plumbing that had been ours, for the way Tyler and I had once filled rooms with music and argued about toothpaste caps. But grief, in my experience, is a material you can fold into a new life. It doesn't vanish. It becomes something else, a raw ingredient. Tyler's distance, that adolescent armor, softened in ways I didn't expect. He began coming over to the apartment under the pretense of helping me organize, and then lingered for longer. He would sit on the second-hand couch and look at the little card rack where Grandma's recipes rested like tiny shingles. One night he took one out and read a line aloud, then looked up at me, and I saw him seeing the life differently. "You did the right thing," he said quietly. "You kept what was ours." There was guilt, too. Not the guilt of having been deceived. Everyone knows that comes with betrayal. But the guilt of realizing how much of my own life I had surrendered to make that protection possible. I had postponed a career. I had deferred small, private joys because I was busy ensuring a future for my son. That reality was a double-edged sword. It hurt to see what I'd lost, and it felt righteous to have used the law as a shield rather than as a sword. I should be clear about motives. People sometimes imagine this kind of strategy is about payback. It isn't. There was no joy in imagining a man bankrupt and humiliated. My pleasure, what there was of it, was very small and quiet. The satisfaction of justice measured in signatures rather than theatrics. I had never wanted to torment Vincent. I wanted to make sure he could not take my son's future if he chose to be reckless. At night, when Tyler slept at his father's, I would go through the day again in my head. I would imagine the week ahead, a judge to hear motions, depositions to be filed, a public ledger that would finally align with private reality. It is one thing to have numbers on a page. It is another to have them adjudicated in front of a person whose pen can make them legally binding. The weeks leading up to the hearing were a study in small cruelties and outward normalities. Vincent continued to arrange for the properties to be photographed for listings. He invited contractors over to talk about upgrades with the smugness of a man who knows he owns the stage now. Brittany posted snapshots of their new life. Lorraine sent a casserole. Diane sent me a message that was at once syrupy and clipped. "If there's anything you need, call." I saved the message and later deleted it because it felt like a paper-thin consolation. Harold, Vincent's lawyer, began to sense something off. He had been a cautious man, methodical, and he found himself pressing for audits and for account reconciliations that Vincent had never wanted. Vincent's first instinct was to push annoyance on the audit. He had always disliked scrutiny. But Harold grew uneasy when merchant invoices started to appear with late fees and when a contractor put a lien on a property. He began asking questions in the way that marks the moment a man realizes his narrative might not be sustainable. And finally, there was the small whisper in the courtroom that started this whole story. When Harold climbed the dais minutes before the judge entered, someone leaned over and read the addendum back to him, the same words that had turned Vincent white. That whisper wasn't the engine of victory. It was confirmation. It was the sound of the law doing its job, of signatures making consequences concrete. I remember the minutes before that whisper as if they were stretched thin. There were people shuffling papers. Someone's phone went off with a soft buzz. A photograph on the wall reflected late afternoon light. I felt no triumphant trumpet. I felt instead a strange, quiet fatigue, like someone who has run a marathon mostly in the dark and now sees the path lit at the finish line. I don't tell you all of this to revel in schadenfreude. I tell you because I want you to see how small decisions and practical protections can change the arc of a life. I tell you because the moral of our story isn't about winning in a public spectacle. It's about the work of stewardship done quietly and faithfully. My grandmother's recipes taught me about the slow alchemy of heat and time. The law, in this instance, was like that. It required patience and precision. There were costs. I left a house I loved. I moved into an apartment that smelled of lemon oil and thrift store upholstery. I took an entry-level interior design class to occupy my hands and mind, coloring palette samples against the wall until one of them, sage green, felt like the right hue for a kitchen that would belong to someone rebuilding. The first time I painted a patchy corner sage green, it felt like painting a promise. Tyler saw me change in small increments. He would roll his eyes at my budget buys and then, later, bring home a friend who complimented the couch. "You did this," he would say, and there would be pride in that, and also a kind of mourning for the life that had been suspended so long. In public, people said things that were meant to comfort, but often landed like small salt in an open wound. "At least you're free," someone said at a brunch, as if freedom and loss were the same thing. Lorraine suggested that I would do well because I was always so resilient. Resilience is a flattering word until you feel it as a demand to survive in silence. But here is the thing. Within the architecture I built, the most important part was preserved. The irrevocable trust sat like a small, unglamorous safe in the legal structure, and Tyler's future sat behind it. That was, for me, everything. The rest, the house, the business, the shine in other people's eyes, were objects that could be taken, owned, resold, or repossessed. They are not the sum of a child's citizenship in a family. The weeks before the hearing were also not without moments of tenderness. Nina would sometimes bring coffee and stand in my kitchen, the kitchen that would soon be someone else's, and we'd talk about nothing but the next week's menu. My uncle, looking at his spreadsheets the way some people look at maps, would pat my hand and say, "You did what you had to do." Tyler drew me a card once that said, in an adolescent scrawl, "Thanks, Mom, for everything." He didn't know the technicalities. He knew the presence. When the day finally came to sit in that courtroom and sign, I felt time condense. I felt the sum of mornings and nights gather around the edges of a single document. Vincent wanted the world to see he was in control. The irony was that control is a poor substitute for understanding. He assumed the narrative was his to shape. He did not realize that law likes to keep careful records. And so, in the mediation room, with water glasses and polite smiles, I signed my name. I signed the release. I accepted a settlement that was not luxurious, but was distinctly enough for an immediate life, enough for rent, for a modest car, for a start. I let him take everything in a way that on the surface looked like defeat. I let him think he had bought his freedom. He didn't know the cost, at least not yet. He signed that day with a grin. He folded his pen and tucked the paper into a folder that smelled faintly of leather and confidence. He walked out of the mediation room, palms empty of the small objects he had once considered trophies, but heavy with titles and deeds. He took photographs on our terrace, posted captions about new beginnings, and wore that newness like armor. He wanted applause. He got bills. The hearing itself was quieter than I had imagined. I thought there might be fireworks, speeches, a dramatic rip of a document. There were none of those things. What there was instead was the slow, clinical work of a court recording signatures and rendering judgment on what those signatures meant. Judge Patricia Holden read the language with the same neutral cadence she used for all the business of other people's lives, calm, precise, unshowy. That steadiness is the kind of thing that leaves you with no recourse for melodrama. The law is a gridded map. It shows you the road and prevents detours. Harold tried to make it a detour. He stood and argued in that careful voice of his that believes precedent bends to the right kind of ferocity. He asked for reconsideration of the addendum's enforceability. He suggested, politely, closely routed through technicalities, that perhaps the liabilities listed were not sufficiently linked to the particular titles transferred. For a moment, his eyes flitted to Vincent, who sat like someone listening to weather reports he had no map to understand. Harold's manner was that of a man trying to save a client from something unpleasant but recognizable. Nina answered with facts. Facts, in the end, are the strangest kind of weapon, blunt, unromantic, and very effective when they're correct. She presented the paper trail, recorded liens, promissory notes, dated invoices, and the chain of custody for the trust documentation. She made each datum feel less like a number and more like a logical domino. The judge listened. She did not clap. She did not sneer. She penciled and made a ruling. The ruling wasn't theatrical. It was a sentence of consequences. The court enforced the settlement as signed. By assenting to the wording of the liability disclosure addendum, Vincent had accepted the debts attached to the properties and businesses he had demanded. The transfer of title was complete in public view, and the transfer of the obligation that came with those titles was, by agreement, all his. He walked out with assets. He also walked out holding the ledger. It took only weeks for the ledger to begin to roar. Contractors who had not been paid sent notices. A vendor filed a mechanic's lien on one of the properties. A lender called, calm at first and then not. Notices arrived with the steady menace of falling leaves, unavoidable and piling. Properties withstood for a small number of weeks the weight of baked-in promises. But promises without cash flow are like balloons full of hot air. Pretty to look at, dangerous when the flame goes out. You can tell a lot about someone by whether they read the documents they sign. Vincent had read some of it, only the glossy parts. The liability addendum had been, for him, a part of the mise-en-scène of victory, a necessary formality. He thought the unpaid contractor would make a call and apologize. He thought a bank would extend a line of credit because of a charismatic interview. He thought markets flattering on Instagram would translate into actual buyers. He had conflated the look of abundance with its substance. He didn't grasp the true scale. One morning, a notice arrived. Total debts associated with the transferred assets, as tallied, were roughly $1.9 million. Asset valuations were publicly estimated by appraisers and analysts and those hungry for news at about $1.6 million. Numbers don't lie because they are cruel. They lie when you expect them to behave like hope. The arithmetic was merciless. Even before foreclosure paperwork began to be scheduled, the math meant cash flow problems and legal entanglements, liens, lawsuits, contested vendor claims. Brittany lasted in the house about as long as it takes a party dress to collect a stain. She announced new plans in a voice that belonged in glossy magazines. She would host dinners, curate the property. In private, when creditors began to call and vendors came to the door, she left. There was the click of shoes on the stairs the morning I found out, and not a theatrical exit, but a practical one, a woman choosing the path that preserved more of her Instagram than her integrity. The rhythm of her leave was quick. She took a handful of belongings, a small plant, her smile. Lorraine's position shifted in a way that was both predictable and in its small humiliations, savage. She had taken such comfort in the appearance of success that the reality of hand-delivered notices and lien stickers on the front door had the effect of social erosion. Her dinners thinned. Her pity became quieter, then smaller. The woman who had once measured worth by what the driveway could hold now had to reckon with the fact that drives can be repossessed. She came to me once, out of breath and incandescent with apology, and we made tea. She offered words that wanted to be comfort, but felt like an ache of guilt. I accepted what I could. An apology isn't a restitution, but it can be the beginning of a smaller, truer conversation. Diane did what people do when the scoreboard shifts unfavorably. She retreated into a silence that felt like avoidance, but which in its own way was admission. At first she messaged, the kind of message that wants to be balm. I wish I'd known. Later she showed up at small communal events and found people who had begun to keep her distance. There is a social calculus to betrayal that operates quietly. You're not summarily banished, but you are moved to the edge of a circle. She sought explanations. I gave her minimal ones. She had been a spy in our house, passively observing and actively reporting. There is little theater in forgiveness. Mostly it's a measurement of whether one is willing to exchange honesty for resumed comfort. Vincent's first public panic was practical. Contractors camped on his doorstep, demanding payment. A plumber who had not been paid in months put a lien on an investment property. A financier called requiring immediate escrow. He began to make moves that were visible and frantic. Airline changes, last-minute signings, as if speed could convert a mounting list into something manageable. Harold called me once, in a voice I recognized as thinly clinical, and tried to negotiate delay. Harold, who had once suggested lawyers could make narratives smoother, now sounded like a man with a cold client and a complex checkbook. He asked for patience. I had none for the desperate sort. Patience had been the main currency of my strategy, and I had spent it. I only had room for consequence. The bank foreclosures were staggered rather than sudden, peculiar in how they unspooled across weeks like a slow curtain dropping. Some of the properties faced immediate forced sales. Others became the scene of judgment hearings, where creditors argued over a dwindling pool that could not satisfy all demands. Vincent, who had spent his life playing with other people's capital and other people's reputations, now had to answer phone calls he had delegated for years. He took calls in the hallway of his new office and listened as lawyers read terms to him. His confidence eroded not in a single place, but in 1,000 small calls where tone changed and collections agents used language that was punctuated by numbers. The business lines that had been touted as thriving found themselves under scrutiny. Leases that had looked like assets were revealed in discovery to be under terms that had cliffs, balloon payments, and escalation clauses. Tenants owed rent. Vendors wanted overdue sums. The glossy exterior peeled like paint in rain. The sort of thing that looks like sound investment on a quarterly report can be, to people living inside it, the slow drip of unpaid labor and deferred maintenance. There were legal consequences, too, though not the vengeful kind people imagine when they say justice. There were lawsuits, contractors suing for unpaid work, vendors suing for broken agreements. There were mechanics' liens, judgments, and courthouse filings. None of it was joyous. It was tedious, procedural, and exacting, the kind of slow legal work that strips away gloss and leaves you with the hard math. Vincent hired bankruptcy counsel. The hearings were procedural, and though bankruptcy can be a tool for reorganizing, it cannot undo the moral landscape of what had happened. It can relieve financial pressure in some forms, but it is also public. Names get listed. The narrative that had been polished over dinner parties now sat in court dockets. This is where the title of this story matters. My husband took everything in the divorce. He didn't know what it would cost him. He took everything, and the cost was not only monetary. It was the way people looked at him when contractors spoke plainly about unpaid bills. The way a creditor said, in a voice that had no malice, "We will proceed in accordance with filing." Consequence is an arithmetic and also a social thing. When debts are unpaid, reputations wobble. Meanwhile, life for Tyler and me took on a quieter texture. We cashed that settlement check and we made choices that felt small and practical and far-sighted. We rented an apartment that had a single bedroom and a kitchen the size of our old pantry. We bought a used table with a little wobble, a couch with a missing button recovered by a thrift find, and a lamp that threw a soft light over Grandma's recipe box when I opened it. The box lived on a small shelf, like an heirloom in miniature, and took on a protective glow. The first night I slept there alone with Tyler at his mother's house, that slip of adolescence where he doubled down on his father's side for reasons I hardly needed to analyze, I felt the kind of aching that is part grief and part relief. I had not wanted to lose the house because of the square footage or the oak floors. I had wanted the house because of its history. Tyler's piano lessons, the first chipped plate we had argued about, the way our old refrigerator hummed like a familiar neighbor. But the house, I realized, had been a stage. The thing I wanted was my son's security. There were practicalities. We signed on for a weekend of moving boxes and thrift store runs. We painted a small corner of the kitchen sage green. Sage green felt salvatory in a way neutral beige never could. It felt like a color chosen on purpose. The paintbrush scraped tiny arcs of renewal into the wall. I found joy in choosing a new curtain rod and an affordable rug and a used set of plates that had small gold flecks. Tyler laughed when I insisted on a new plant. He named it Rosemary and offered to water it. These small rituals helped stitch a new normal. Tyler's relationship with his father was a slow work of repair. He had been a teenager in a house that looked like a winning narrative. When the truth came into view, when he learned by way of lunchtime messages and half-remembered conversations what had been happening with the finances, his anger had a sharp edge. He spent a period of time blaming both of us, and then, in the careful way only teenagers do, began to separate the people from the narrative. "You protected me," he said one night, after a week of arriving late to dinner and leaving early. That's what matters. It was the kind of teenage accolade that feels both huge and simple. I accepted it. It helped. We started to rebuild slowly. I took an interior design course because I wanted a way to earn money that felt like stretching towards something I had once deferred. It was the kind of small, deliberate reinvention that felt safe. Practical classes, a teacher who liked palettes and fabric samples. My first paid gig was modest. A friend who needed help turning a spare room into a home office. I went over with paint swatches and a spirit that was equal parts nervous and hopeful. We painted a wall a muted blue and bought a desk that fit the space. The friend cried in the corner when she saw the finished room and said, "It looks like you did this because you needed to. Thank you." Her gratitude felt silly and enormous at once. There is a strange sense of liberty in small projects. When you no longer have the weight of other people's unpaid bills on your shoulders, your decisions shrink to what you can affect. You choose a rug not because it is spectacular, but because it brings warmth. You buy a kettle because almost every good conversation in a small apartment begins with boiling water. My life did not become glamorous. It became real. I had some complicated, unexpected moments of social currency. People who had applauded Vincent's ostentation now came to me with quiet questions. Some were sincere, some were merely curious to check if he had been as unsteady as it now appeared. Those interactions felt like a reset, awkward, sometimes accusatory, often thin in contrition. I took what I needed and left the rest. I had no taste for performative reconciliation. If someone wanted to step back into the circle, it meant time. Harold's calls stopped being frequent. When he did call, it was for procedural reasons or out of habit, settlement paperwork, litigation updates. There was a hum of professional exchange. Nina continued to be a presence in my life for months, her calm voice a tether through several hearings. She did not celebrate with champagne, nor did she gloat. We had both known for some months that the system had done what agreements had been designed to do, turned signatures into obligations. That was victory enough. One afternoon, a man with a county-issued envelope came to our old house to post a notice. He told me that a contractor had posted a lien. I watched the notice as if it were a small, vindictive meteor. He handed me the envelope out of habit. Our names were on the structure of public record, and then left. I tore the envelope open like someone looking for a sign. There it was, the legal language that I had spent months anticipating. It was not vicious. It was exact. It was decisive. Vincent's public stance adjusted into a more somber cadence. He began attending hearings. He dialed into calls with foreclosure counsel and attempted to restructure obligations. He looked thinner in photographs and more careful. That carefulness did not resolve moral responsibility. It did, however, shift the social picture. People who had once wanted to bask in his reflected glow now kept their distance. There is a human economy to shame and consequence that is not delightful to behold, even when it is deserved. Over the months, Tyler's trust, the irrevocable structure that had sat in place like a small, unshowy fortress, performed exactly as intended. It did not cancel the hurt, nor did it erase long nights or the sense of having been betrayed. What it did was practical. It prevented unilateral seizure of the funds destined for him. The trust was a legal instrument, not a cure, but it bought us breathing room and a future that would be hard to revoke. When Tyler learned of its specifics, names, dates, clauses, he read the documents with a seriousness that felt like adulthood arriving. He folded the paper carefully and kept a copy in his room. People ask me sometimes if it felt like revenge. I tell them that it felt instead like insulation. There is a word I like less: repair. What I built was not punitive, it was protective. I have little interest in retribution. I have a son who needs a life. I have my own need for dignity. The law, in this context, is a pragmatic place where both can be arranged. Vincent filed for bankruptcy months later. It was not a theatrical filing. Bankruptcy is a legal process with strict rules and complicated disclosures. It can reorganize debt, delay creditor action, and sometimes provide a fresh start. It is not an equalizer for moral wrongs. It is a tool for financial rearrangement. I watched the filings like one watches weather, interested and aware, but unable to affect the storm. When he filed, there were mandatory disclosures that made the public ledger of his obligations even clearer. Papers were filed, transcripts recorded, creditors listed. The story that had been private now existed in a new, sober publicness. That publicness did not enrich me. It did not lighten the nights. It did, however, make clear what was already true. The spectacle of acquisition had a cost. Brittany's exit from the life came without bitterness from me. I felt her leave as a relief, more than anything, a closure without ceremonies. For a while, our mutual acquaintances assigned her the role of the other woman, as if moral responsibility were a costume to be worn. She did her best to disappear with dignity. People who seek the sun for quick warmth seldom stay for the nights. There is a quiet moment I return to sometimes, when I think of how this felt at its most personal. It was a morning after one of Tyler's exams. He came into the kitchen, still in a hoodie, hair rumpled, and made coffee with the small ritual of someone learning how to be steady. He took out Grandma's recipe box and pulled a card. He made the recipe, an old lemon cake she used to bake, and we ate it standing by the counter. He looked at me, sleepy and yet clear-eyed, and said, "You did the right thing. You kept me." Those words came with the simple authority of a child who had learned that his mother was not perfect, but she was unwavering. I think often about what everything meant to him then. In his father's hands it had been property and status and the story that could be told at charity galas. In our life after, it had been the slow accumulation of small things, an approved trust, a steady bed, the security of a school schedule that didn't shift with the market. The difference between appearance and reality is not philosophical when it involves children. it is practical. People write to me sometimes asking for specifics. How did you do that? And it's always a strange exchange because the answer is both simple and complicated. The simple part is this: I protected what I could that was legally separable and placed a priority on my child's future. The complicated part is that this required patience, legal help, and a willingness to look unheroic in public while building something defensible. That combination is not dazzling. It is steady work. I do not pretend every story ends cleanly. Years later, the properties still lingered in various forms: a foreclosure here, a contested creditors hearing there, a small business that never recovered. Vincent's public life became quieter. He gave fewer interviews, attended fewer galas, and in time showed up at community events with a guardedness that belonged to someone who had seen the ledger. He made moves to settle what he could. He tried to reconstruct his reputation in smaller ways. Some people forgave him. Some never could. Diane's relationship with our circle adjusted. She tried to make reparation in the way one does when social capital has been spent: prolonged apologies, offers of service. People accepted some of it and refused other parts. There are social accounts that cannot be reconciled in the same way financial ones can. There was, surprisingly, a small audience that respected my restraint. Some people wrote to say they had been through similar things and that my story had offered them courage to act with forethought rather than fury. That is perhaps the most meaningful response, when a private act of protection becomes model rather than spectacle. Justice, so far as I can tell, is less about public measures and more about private safety. Months turned into a year, and the apartment became more like home. I painted a subtle sage green wall in the kitchen, and the color settled like a small promise. I hung pictures of Tyler and me, candid shots of the two of us laughing over pasta that was badly documented, but delicious. I kept the recipe box near the kettle. At night, I sometimes took it down and read a card, just to hear the handwriting that had guided my grandmother through war years and lean seasons. Her words, "Not everything that looks like bread will feed you," had become a truth I could carry without spectacle. I took on more interior design work, not because I needed glamour, but because the work engaged my hands and scaled in a way that fit teenage talk and court calendars. My clients were people who wanted a small, steady transformation, someone who needed to feel their living room again, a young family that wanted a calming nursery and muted tones. I built a small business in a way that felt ethical and incremental. The income was not extravagant, but it was mine, and it felt clean. Tyler graduated high school with a small ceremony. He wore a tie that was a shade too loud, and we laughed about it afterward. He gave a speech that mentioned, in a passing line, the support he'd received. "My mom," he said, "kept me stable. She made choices for both of us when it wasn't easy. That is how love works sometimes." The room was small, and the applause was polite and real in an everyday way. I sat and felt the weight of those years lift in a way I couldn't have predicted. It wasn't jubilation. It was the gentle, steady thing of a life that had been rearranged to survive. People often want an ending with a showy object: assets returned, public apologies, flashy vindication. Our ending was quiet and, in some ways, more satisfying. The legal machinery did its work. Signatures mattered. Liabilities followed titles. The trust did its quiet job of providing a future for a child. The social consequences were applied. Relationships shifted. Reputations adjusted. I did not revel. I preserved. Once, Lorraine visited and brought a tattered ramekin that had belonged to my grandmother and which she had found in a box when clearing the house. "I found this," she said, with a tentative kind of gentleness. It was an olive green dish with a chip at the edge. She handed it to me like a small offering. We talked a little, carefully. I accepted it, partly because the gestures of human warmth are valuable, and partly because the things that remain in the world matter to children and to memory. In the evenings, once Tyler was asleep and there were no urgent emails, I would sit with the recipe box and flip through cards that smelled faintly of oil and spice. I would read my grandmother's handwriting and feel the continuity of someone who knew how to survive sharp changes. The recipes are not metaphors for legal work. They are reminders that life is fed by small, steady acts. The law protected our future. The recipes fed us now. Sometimes, when a certain kind of narrative voice wants a tidy flourish, it imagines me standing on a stage, reciting this as a lesson. My life does not accommodate that fantasy. The lesson, such as it is quieter. Paperwork matters, patience matters, but so do breakfasts and scraped-knee consolations and paintings in sage green. Those things together make a life that the ledger cannot touch. There is a finality to the way this reads in the public imagination. He took everything, and therefore he lost. The truth sits in a smaller space between those extremes. He took the house and the business and the visibility, and with them he took a weight. That weight included debt, public filings, and a reputation adjusted by facts. He did not lose in the moralistic sense as much as he lost the ease of moving through the world unexamined. The cost was practical, social, and sometimes lonely. There was nuance, there was consequence. When people ask whether I'm happy with how it turned out, I offer a different metric. Am I safe? Is Tyler safe? Do we have dignity? Can we eat dinner without the background buzz of creditors' calls? Those answers are yes. There is a humility to being content rather than jubilant. There is also a steadiness in knowing that even when a partner decides to take everything, you can decide to hold on to what truly matters. A friend once told me, after a long lunch where we compared scars and recipes, that I had become fluent in a kind of practical optimism. I like that phrasing. It suggests a language learned through necessity, craft, not performance. I kept the trust and the IRA, and those small, unglamorous measures made a future that could not be easily taken away. The last time I saw Vincent in public was at a community event where he arrived with a smaller entourage. We exchanged the minimal courtesies of people who were once intimately connected and now had contractual distance. His eyes were not cruel. They were less bright with certainty and more shaded with the kind of fatigue that numbers produce. He had, in a sense, inherited the work that comes with property, collection calls, contractor disputes, and the sometimes humiliating necessity of renegotiation. He had what he had asked for. He had also, very clearly, what he did not ask for: persistent, exact consequences. I do not write to humiliate him. I write to affirm that legal consequence is a different sort of justice than spectacle. My strategy was not theatrical revenge. It was a legal architecture built in the service of a child's future and of my own ability to breathe after years of caretaking. That difference matters because it keeps the story from becoming something uglier. Vengeance, which corrodes the architect as much as the target, and instead keeps it to the sober, functional realm of protection. At night sometimes, I stand by the kitchen window and look out at the light on the street. I keep the recipe box on the shelf. I keep the trust documents filed and the receipts scanned. I do this quietly because my life now values privacy the way other people value applause. That privacy has room for small joys, a bowl of soup that couldn't be faster, a client who calls to say her living room finally feels like home. Tyler, who once tested loyalty as a teenager and now offers it as a steady companion. If you remember one thing from this story, let it be this. When someone tells you they want everything, they may not understand that everything carries weight. My husband took everything, and it cost him in ways he did not immediately foresee. Those costs are not vengeance. They are consequence, and consequence is a kind of moral arithmetic that the law can render intelligible when signatures are in place. My grandmother's card is still in the box. I keep it in view when I make tea. It says simply, "Not everything that looks like bread will feed you." I think of that line as I move through the day. The law, when used carefully, can be like a recipe: precise measurements, attention to timing, and a little patience. It is not miraculous. It is faithful. It preserves. If this story resonated with you, if you want to hear more about how people use legal tools to protect themselves and their families rather than to enact theater, there are other stories like this in the playlist. Small architectures of survival in messy lives. Click through and listen to them. They will not all end the same way. They will, however, remind you that when you protect what matters, you are doing something practical and profound. He wanted the house, the cars, the business. He took them. He didn't know he'd also be signing for the bill. He paid, in the end, for an accumulation that looked like victory and felt like liability. I walked away with less shine and more certainty. I walked away with a son who sleeps in his own room and a recipe box that smells like lemon and cardamom. I walked away with the knowledge that patient, quiet work and a few well-placed documents can keep a future safe when someone else decides to spend recklessly. That is the story I can offer, not a tale of revenge, but a record of protection. It is the kind of justice that happens in the white spaces of forms and signatures, in the patient work of an attorney who understands architecture, and in the small acts of a woman who decided to bake the bread that would actually feed her child.